Good evening, and welcome. Tonight's story takes us to a quiet little town where the lights of an old library never go out, no matter the hour. Some say people visit to borrow books. Others believe they leave carrying something far more valuable. If you enjoy peaceful bedtime stories like this, please subscribe to our channel and join us for many more relaxing journeys. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let tonight's story begin. The rain had been falling since early afternoon. Not the kind that hurried people indoors, but the gentle sort that wrapped the world in a soft silver curtain. Ethan Brooks watched tiny drops race across the train window as the countryside drifted slowly past. Rolling green hills faded into quiet forests. Old stone bridges crossed peaceful streams. The farther the train traveled, the quieter everything became. He wasn't running away. At least, that was what he kept telling himself. After years of deadlines, crowded meetings, and a life measured by calendars instead of seasons, Ethan had taken a month's leave from work. He had no destination in mind, only a simple promise: to keep traveling until he found a place that felt different. Late that evening, the conductor stopped beside his seat. "We'll be arriving at Cedar Hollow in 5 minutes," he said with a gentle smile. Not many passengers get off there. Ethan looked out the window. A small town slowly appeared through the rain. Warm lights glowed from brick buildings lining a quiet main street. Flower boxes rested beneath every window. A clock tower stood peacefully above the square. Nothing looked extraordinary, yet something about the town felt wonderfully calm. When the train came to a stop, Ethan stepped onto the small platform. The cool air smelled of rain, cedar trees, and freshly baked bread. Somewhere nearby, a church bell quietly marked the hour. As the train disappeared into the mist, Ethan noticed one curious thing. At the far end of the street, one building still shone brightly. Every other shop had closed for the night, but the old library was just opening its doors. The warm glow spilling from the library windows seemed even brighter as Ethan crossed the rain-soaked street. The old oak door stood slightly open, as though it had been waiting for someone to arrive. Above it hung a carved wooden sign: Cedar Hollow Public Library. Its paint had faded with time, but every letter was still carefully cared for. Ethan stepped inside. A small brass bell chimed softly overhead. The scent of old books, polished wood, and freshly brewed tea welcomed him before anyone spoke a word. Towering bookshelves stretched toward the high ceiling. Rolling ladders rested quietly against the shelves. Small reading lamps cast pools of golden light onto worn wooden tables. Near the fireplace, several people sat reading in complete silence. No one looked hurried. No one glanced at a clock. Only the crackling fire and the gentle rhythm of rain against the windows filled the room. Behind a broad oak desk stood an elderly librarian arranging a stack of returned books. Her silver hair was tied neatly into a loose bun, and a pair of round spectacles rested low on her nose. She looked up and smiled. It was the kind of smile that made a stranger feel strangely familiar. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome to Cedar Hollow Library." Ethan smiled politely. "I'm sorry. I noticed your lights were still on. I wasn't sure if you were closing." The librarian gave a quiet laugh. "My dear." She gently placed the last book onto the shelf beside her. "We've never believed that comfort should keep office hours." Ethan blinked. She continued with the same gentle smile. "Books have a curious habit of finding people exactly when they're needed." She picked up a steaming teacup from the desk and offered it to him. Coming out of the rain, the stories have been waiting patiently. Outside, the rain continued its quiet song. Inside, time itself seemed to lower its voice. Ethan accepted the warm teacup with both hands. The gentle heat spread through his fingers as the rain whispered softly against the tall windows. "Thank you," he said. The librarian smiled. "My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm Ethan. It's a pleasure to meet you, Ethan." She stepped out from behind the oak desk and motioned toward the nearest bookshelf. "Would you like a little tour?" "I'd like that." Together, they wandered between the towering shelves. Each section was marked with hand-carved wooden signs: history, poetry, travel, nature, letters and journals. Every shelf was filled with books that looked well-loved rather than merely old. Some carried faded cloth covers. Others gleamed with polished leather bindings. Each one seemed to have been opened many times by careful hands. As they walked, Ethan noticed something curious. The library was busy. A young woman sat by the fireplace, slowly turning the pages of a gardening book. An elderly man studied an old atlas beneath a green reading lamp. Near one of the windows, a father quietly read aloud while his little daughter rested against his shoulder, already drifting toward sleep. No one checked a watch. No one glanced toward the entrance. There was no restless tapping of feet, no hurried whispers, only peaceful reading. It feels, Ethan began. Margaret looked at him kindly. Different. He nodded. It almost feels as if people forget what time it is. Margaret's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. Perhaps they do. She gently ran a hand along a row of worn book spines. Or perhaps they simply remember that not every hour needs to be counted. Ethan looked around once more. For the first time in a very long while, he realized he hadn't thought about tomorrow in nearly an hour. And somehow, that felt like the greatest gift a library could offer. Margaret led Ethan deeper into the library, where the tall shelves gradually gave way to a quieter corner tucked beneath a wide stained glass window. The colors of the glass shimmered softly in the lamplight, painting gentle patterns across the wooden floor. This part of the library felt different. Not grander, not older, simply quieter. Above the nearest bookshelf hung a small hand-carved sign. Books that found their readers. Ethan smiled. That's an unusual name for a section. Margaret nodded. It surprises most visitors. He glanced along the shelves. There were no labels to describe the books. No cards recommending popular titles. No list of bestsellers. Only rows of carefully arranged volumes in every size and color. I don't understand, Ethan admitted. How does someone choose a book here? Margaret folded her hands gently. Most people try. They read the titles. They compare the covers. They walk away. And then, she smiled. They come back. Ethan raised an eyebrow. They return. They do. Usually because one particular book refuses to leave their thoughts. He laughed softly. That sounds impossible. Perhaps. She reached for an old leather-bound volume resting quietly on the middle shelf. I've worked here for 42 years. I've learned not to argue with peaceful impossibilities. She returned the book to its place. Take your time. There is no right choice. No wrong one either. The book that belongs in your hands has always been patient. Margaret quietly stepped away, leaving Ethan alone among the shelves. The rain tapped gently against the stained glass window. The fire crackled somewhere in the distance. Ethan looked slowly across the rows of books. For reasons he couldn't explain, one small blue volume near the very end of the shelf seemed impossible to overlook. Ethan reached for the small blue volume with careful hands. Its cloth cover was soft with age, and the corners had been rounded by countless readers before him. When he lifted it from the shelf, a faint scent of cedar and old paper drifted into the air. The title was pressed into the cover with simple silver lettering. The Art of Unhurried Days. He searched his memory. The title meant nothing to him. There was no famous author's name beneath it. Only a small line that read, "Collected from many quiet lives." Curious, Ethan carried the book to a reading chair near the fireplace. He settled into the soft cushion while the fire cast warm amber light across the pages. The first page contained no introduction, only a single sentence. A hurried life often arrives long before the heart does. Ethan read it again, then a third time. The words were simple, yet they settled quietly in his mind. He turned the page. The first reflection came from a woman who had spent 40 years teaching music to children. She wrote that her happiest memories were never the concerts or the awards. They were the moments after class, when a student stayed behind to play one more song simply because they loved it. Another page told the story of a mail carrier who had walked the same neighborhood for 3 decades. He admitted he could no longer remember every letter he had delivered, but he never forgot the smiles waiting on the front porches. Ethan continued reading. None of the stories were dramatic. None tried to impress. Each one felt like a quiet conversation beside a warm fire. Without realizing it, he leaned back in the chair and let out a slow, contented breath. For the first time in years, he wasn't reading to finish a book. He was reading simply to enjoy the next page. The fire had burned lower, settling into a bed of glowing embers that filled the library with a soft amber light. Ethan slowly turned another page, then another. Outside, the rain had faded to a gentle mist, leaving tiny droplets clinging to the tall, arched windows. The library had become even quieter. Somewhere in the distance, a page turned. A teacup was placed gently upon a wooden table. The old floorboards gave a single quiet creak before returning to silence. Ethan smiled. He had forgotten how comforting ordinary sounds could be. Eventually, he stretched his shoulders and happened to glance toward the large clock above the fireplace. Its brass hands rested just past midnight. He blinked. That couldn't be right. When he had entered the library, evening had only just begun. He looked around. No one seemed surprised. The young woman still tended to her gardening book. The elderly gentleman continued tracing rivers across the pages of his old atlas. The father still sat beside the window, though now his daughter slept peacefully against his shoulder while his book remained open in his lap. Margaret quietly appeared beside Ethan, carrying a fresh pot of tea. "You look surprised," she said with a gentle smile. "I didn't realize it had become so late." She poured 2 cups without hurry. Most people don't. Ethan glanced toward the front doors. "They're still unlocked." "They are. You don't close at midnight?" Margaret shook her head. "We've never measured our evenings by the clock." She handed him a warm cup of tea. "Sometimes a traveler needs an hour. Sometimes they need an entire night." She looked around the peaceful room. "We simply stay open until everyone has found the page they came for." Ethan wrapped both hands around the teacup. For reasons he couldn't explain, that answer felt perfectly natural. Ethan sipped his tea slowly while the fire cast a warm glow across the library. For a long while, neither he nor Margaret spoke. The silence felt comfortable, like 2 old friends enjoying the same peaceful evening. Finally, Ethan looked up at the endless rows of books surrounding them. "How long has this library been here?" he asked. Margaret smiled, as though she had been waiting for the question. "Nearly 150 years." She gently traced her fingertips across the polished edge of the oak table. The building began as a single reading room. There were only 3 shelves and 1 window. Ethan glanced toward the towering collection stretching into every corner. "It has certainly grown." "It has," Margaret replied, "but not only with books." She stood and invited Ethan to follow her. Together they walked beyond the main collection into another quiet hall lined with glass-fronted cabinets. Inside rested leather journals, neatly tied bundles of handwritten letters, recipe books with flour-dusted pages, carefully folded maps, sketchbooks, and travel diaries whose covers had faded beneath the passing years. "There are very few famous names here," Margaret said softly. "Most belong to ordinary people. A baker, a schoolteacher, a carpenter, a nurse, a fisherman." She lifted one small notebook from the shelf. "It isn't greatness that preserves a memory. It's care." She carefully returned the notebook to its place. "History often remembers remarkable events. We try to remember remarkable lives." Ethan paused before a shelf filled with family recipe books. Tiny handwritten notes filled the margins. "Add a little more cinnamon on cold mornings. Grandmother always stirred the soup clockwise." He smiled. The pages weren't filled with grand discoveries. They were filled with love. As Ethan looked around the room, he realized the library wasn't simply protecting books. It was quietly protecting the gentle. Margaret paused beside a narrow wooden door near the back of the library. Unlike the grand oak doors at the entrance, this one was simple, painted a soft shade of forest green. A small brass key rested in the lock. Above the doorway hung a hand-carved sign, "Letters Never Sent." Ethan read the words twice. "They're exactly what they sound like," Margaret said with a gentle smile. She turned the key, and the door opened without a sound. The room beyond was small and wonderfully peaceful. Only 4 comfortable chairs surrounded a round wooden table. A single reading lamp cast a warm circle of light across its polished surface. Shelves lined the walls, each holding carefully organized boxes wrapped in linen cloth. No names appeared on the shelves, only quiet labels. To family, to friends, to someone long gone, to myself. Ethan looked at Margaret. People donated these? They did. Some wrote them years ago. Some never intended anyone else to read them. She gently rested a hand on one of the boxes. When they were ready, they chose to leave them here. Not to be judged, simply to be cared for. Ethan opened one of the carefully preserved letters. The handwriting was neat but unhurried. It began, "Dear Dad, I don't know if I will ever have the courage to say these words aloud." He stopped reading after the first few lines. Not because the letter was sad, but because it felt deeply personal. He quietly closed it and returned it to its place. Margaret nodded with quiet understanding. Some letters don't need an audience. They only need a safe place to rest. Ethan looked around the peaceful room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, rain whispered softly against the windows. Inside, the unsent words had already found their home. Margaret quietly opened a small drawer beneath the round table. Inside rested a stack of cream-colored writing paper, a fountain pen filled with dark blue ink, and a simple envelope without a name. She placed them gently before Ethan. "There is no expectation," she said softly. "You don't have to write." He looked at the blank page. "I wouldn't know where to begin." Margaret smiled. "Most meaningful things begin exactly there." With that, she stepped outside the room, gently closing the door behind her. Ethan was alone. The rain had almost stopped now. Only the occasional drop slid down the window pane, catching the warm glow of the reading lamp. He picked up the fountain pen, then set it down again. For years, writing had been his profession. Every sentence had a purpose. Every paragraph was revised. Every article had a deadline. This page asked for none of those things. It asked only for honesty. After several quiet minutes, he wrote a single sentence. "I think I've been hurrying for so long that I forgot what I was trying to reach." He read the words. There was nothing remarkable about them. No perfect phrasing. No grand realization. Just the truth. He continued writing. Not about work. Not about success. Instead, he wrote about small things he had quietly missed. The sound of rain against a window. Breakfast shared without checking the time. The comfort of reading one chapter instead of 10. The peaceful silence between conversations. When he finally laid down the pen, the page was only half full. Yet somehow, it felt complete. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the envelope. There was no address, no stamp, only his quiet thoughts, resting exactly where they needed to be. For the first time in many years, Ethan wrote something that needed nothing more. Ethan held the sealed envelope for a long moment. Its weight was almost nothing, yet it seemed to carry far more than a single sheet of paper. Margaret returned just as quietly as she had left. She noticed the envelope resting in his hands, but said nothing. Instead, she walked to a small wooden cabinet built into the far wall. Unlike the other shelves, this one had no lock. Only a polished brass handle worn smooth by many gentle hands. She opened the cabinet. Inside were dozens of envelopes. Some were thick, some were thin. Some had been folded so many times that the paper had softened with age. None carried a full name. Only initials, dates, or sometimes no markings at all. Margaret looked at Ethan. "If you'd like, it can stay here. There is no need to decide today." Ethan looked once more at the envelope. Then, with a quiet smile, he placed it among the others. Not to forget it, but because he no longer needed to carry it everywhere he went. Margaret gently closed the cabinet. "The interesting thing," she said, "is that most people believe they come here searching for the right book." She paused, listening to the quiet crackle of the fireplace beyond the doorway. "But after all these years, I think they're really searching for the right moment. The moment to slow down. The moment to forgive. The moment to remember." Ethan stood silently beside her. The words settled into the room as gently as dust upon old books. For the first time in a very long while, he realized he wasn't planning tomorrow. He wasn't revisiting yesterday. He was simply standing exactly where he was. And somehow, that felt wonderfully enough. Outside, the clouds slowly drifted apart. For the first time that evening, a few quiet stars appeared above Cedar Hollow. As the evening settled into a peaceful silence, Ethan's eyes wandered toward a narrow spiral staircase tucked behind one of the tallest bookshelves. He was certain it hadn't caught his attention before. Its wooden steps curved gently upward, disappearing into a softly lit gallery above. A small brass lantern glowed at the top. Margaret noticed where he was looking. "You found the oldest part of the library," she said with a smile. "It doesn't ask for much attention. It simply waits." Together, they climbed the staircase. The old wood creaked gently beneath their feet, not with complaint, but with the familiar voice of something that had faithfully carried generations of readers. The gallery above felt wonderfully peaceful. Sunlight no longer reached these shelves. Instead, warm reading lamps bathed every corner in a golden glow. Here, the books looked older. Some wore faded cloth covers. Others had leather bindings stitched carefully by hand. A few carried tiny repairs so skillfully done that they seemed almost invisible. Ethan reached toward one of the books, but paused. "It looks fragile." Margaret nodded. "It has been read for more than 100 years." She lifted it carefully from the shelf. What keeps it alive isn't perfect paper. It's the care of every person who has repaired it. She opened the book to reveal delicate stitching along its spine. Each librarian adds a little more strength. Not enough to erase its age. Only enough to help it welcome the next reader. Ethan gently ran a finger above the repaired binding without touching it. It isn't being restored to look new, he said quietly. Margaret smiled. No, it's being cared for so it can continue its story. The words lingered in Ethan's mind. Perhaps people weren't so different from old books. None of them needed to become new again. Sometimes, they simply needed enough kindness to turn one more page. At the far end of the gallery stood a small wooden door. Margaret opened it gently. Beyond was a quiet workshop filled with the comforting scent of paper, cedar, and warm beeswax. A long oak workbench rested beneath a row of tall windows. Neatly arranged upon it were small brushes, linen thread, tiny scissors, glass jars of natural paste, and strips of soft cloth in every shade of cream and brown. Everything had its place. Nothing looked hurried. Ethan stepped closer. In the center of the table lay an old book waiting to be repaired. Its cover was worn. Several pages had come loose. The spine carried the marks of many careful readings. It has lived a full life, Margaret said softly. She picked up a fine needle threaded with pale linen. Every repair we make is meant to last, but we never try to hide it. Ethan looked more closely. Tiny stitches were visible along the spine. Small patches of matching paper blended naturally into the pages without pretending they had always been there. You leave the repairs where people can see them? Margaret nodded. A repaired book shouldn't pretend it was never damaged. She carefully stitched one loose page into place. The marks remind future readers that someone cared enough to mend it. The room fell peacefully silent again. Only the gentle pull of thread through paper could be heard. Ethan watched each slow movement. There was no rush, no race to finish, only quiet attention. He found himself wondering how many people spent their lives trying to hide every scar, every mistake, every difficult season. Perhaps, he thought, those places did not make a life less beautiful. Perhaps they showed where kindness had quietly done its work. Margaret tied the final knot and closed the book with a contented smile. It isn't perfect, she said. It never needed to be. It simply needed another chance to be read. Ethan smiled. For reasons he couldn't quite explain. Those words felt meant for F. By the time they left the workshop, the rain had stopped. Margaret opened a pair of wooden doors at the back of the library. Cool evening air drifted inside, carrying the scent of wet earth and cedar. Beyond the doorway was a quiet courtyard. Stone paths wound through lavender and white daisies, their petals still sparkling with raindrops. At the center stood a great maple tree, its branches decorated with softly glowing lanterns. Several visitors sat beneath its shade. An elderly woman knitted while a book rested on her lap. A young couple quietly shared a novel. Near the fountain, a boy sketched the garden with careful hands. No one seemed in a hurry. Ethan smiled. It feels like the library continues out here. Margaret nodded. I've always believed a library is more than books. She looked around the peaceful garden. It's a place where people remember how to listen, to stories, to one another, and sometimes, to themselves. A gentle breeze stirred the lanterns above them. The fountain murmured softly. Pages turned in the evening air. For a few quiet moments, Ethan closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about work. He wasn't planning tomorrow. He was simply present. And in that peaceful courtyard, beneath the maple tree, that felt like enough. As they walked beneath the maple tree, Ethan noticed a small wooden box hanging from one of its lower branches. A handwritten sign above it read, "Take one, leave one." Curious, he opened the lid. Inside were dozens of neatly folded notes. Some looked new. Others had yellowed with age. Margaret smiled. Visitors have been leaving little messages here for many years. They aren't signed. They're simply gifts for whoever comes next. Ethan unfolded one at random. It read, "Don't wait for life to become easier before enjoying today." He folded it carefully and chose another. The people who love you rarely remember your busiest days. They remember the moments you truly spent with them. The words were simple, yet they lingered in his mind. "May I leave one?" he asked. "Of course," Margaret replied. She handed him a small blank card and a pencil. Ethan thought for a moment before writing. "If you're reading this, I hope you remember to rest. The world can wait a little while." He folded the note and placed it gently inside the box. Margaret closed the lid with a quiet smile. "One day," she said, "someone will need exactly those words." A soft breeze rustled the maple leaves overhead. The lantern swayed gently. Ethan realized that even the smallest message could become a light for someone else. Sometimes, hope didn't arrive in long speeches. Sometimes, it fit on a single piece of paper. The next morning, soft sunlight filtered through the library's tall windows. The warm glow settled across the wooden floors, giving the room a peaceful golden light. As Ethan wandered between the shelves, he noticed a narrow passage hidden behind the tallest bookcase. Curious, he stepped inside. It opened into a small reading nook. Tiny wooden chairs surrounded a colorful rug. Low bookshelves were filled with picture books, fairy tales, and adventure stories. Handmade drawings covered one wall. Each was signed by a child who had visited the library over the years. Margaret smiled as she joined him. "This has always been my favorite corner." She picked up an old storybook. Many of the adults who visit today once sat right here as children. Ethan gently turned the pages. The book showed signs of being loved. Its corners were worn, and a few pages had been carefully repaired. "It has been read hundreds of times," Margaret said, "and every reader added something invisible." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. She smiled. "A memory." Ethan looked around the little room. He imagined generations of children laughing, listening, and dreaming beneath these same shelves. The books had not only told stories, they had quietly become part of people's own stories. As he placed the book back on the shelf, Ethan realized that some places never stopped teaching. They simply welcomed each new generation with the same gentle kindness. Outside, the morning birds began to sing. Inside, another young reader opened a book for the very first time. Near the front desk, Ethan noticed a thick journal resting on a wooden stand. Its cover read, "The book that stayed with me." He opened it carefully. Each page held a short note from a visitor. Not a review, not a summary, just a few words about a book that had quietly changed their life. One entry read, "This book reminded me to call my mother before it was too late." Another simply said, "I laughed for the first time in months." A third was even shorter. "I finally forgave myself." Ethan slowly turned the pages. Every message was different, but they all shared one thing. The books had stayed with their readers long after they were returned to the shelves. Margaret walked over with 2 cups of tea. "We keep that journal," she said, "because stories never truly end when the last page is turned. They continue in the lives of the people who read them." Ethan nodded. He picked up the pen beside the journal. After a quiet moment, he wrote, "I came here looking for a place to rest. I found a quieter way to live." He closed the journal gently. Some books filled your shelves. Others quietly became part of who you were. As the morning sunlight reached across the pages, another visitor stepped through the library doors, ready to begin a story of their own. Late that afternoon, Margaret wheeled a small cart filled with returned books through the library. "Would you like to help?" she asked. "I'd be happy to," Ethan replied. Together, they walked slowly between the shelves, returning each book to its proper place. Margaret never rushed. Before placing a book back on the shelf, she gently brushed away any dust and straightened its cover. Ethan smiled. "You treat every book like an old friend." Margaret laughed softly. "Perhaps they are." She carefully slid a novel into its place. "Every book leaves for a while. It travels through someone's life. And when it returns, we quietly welcome it home." Ethan looked at the rows of books surrounding them. Thousands of stories rested patiently on the shelves. Some had been borrowed hundreds of times. Yet each one waited with the same quiet patience for its next reader. He placed the final book onto a shelf and stepped back. The library felt peaceful, not because it was silent, but because everything seemed exactly where it belonged. Margaret smiled. "People often think libraries are about collecting books." She shook her head gently. "I think they're about sharing them." Ethan looked around one more time. Perhaps that was true of kindness as well. The more it was shared, the more it seemed to find its way home. Evening settled gently over Cedar Hollow. Golden light from the reading lamps filled the library with a quiet warmth. As Ethan walked between the shelves, one corner caught his attention. Beside the fireplace stood a comfortable armchair. A small lamp glowed beside it. An open book rested on the table, yet no one was sitting there. "It has been empty all day," Ethan said. Margaret smiled. "Yes. Shouldn't someone use it?" "They will." She adjusted the lamp just a little. "We always keep one chair ready." Ethan looked at her curiously. For whom? For the person who doesn't know they need it yet. She smiled toward the empty chair. Sometimes a traveler arrives tired. Sometimes lonely. Sometimes carrying worries they cannot explain. It's comforting to know a place is already waiting. Ethan stood quietly. The chair wasn't reserved. It wasn't marked with a name. It simply waited with quiet patience. A few moments later, the front door opened. A young woman stepped inside, shaking the rain from her umbrella. She looked around uncertainly. Then her eyes settled on the empty chair. With a grateful smile, she walked over, sat down, and opened a book. Margaret whispered, "You see, hope often begins with something as simple as a place prepared in advance." Ethan smiled. Sometimes, the kindest welcome required no words at all. The next morning, soft sunlight poured through the library windows. Ethan knew it was time to continue his journey. He packed his small bag and returned the blue book, The Art of Unhurried Days, to its place on the shelf. Margaret met him at the front desk with a warm smile. "I thought you might like something to remember us by." She handed him a simple handmade bookmark. It was woven from blue and cream-colored thread. Pressed inside was a single maple leaf. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were a few quiet words. A good book does not ask you to stay. It simply helps you leave a little wiser. Ethan read the message twice. Then he slipped the bookmark inside his own notebook. "I'll keep this," he said. "I hope you do," Margaret replied. "But not because it came from this library." She smiled gently. "Keep it because one day you'll open a book, find it again, and remember to slow down." Ethan nodded. He realized the bookmark was more than a gift. It was a gentle reminder. Some stories ended with the final page. The best ones quietly continued in everyday life. As he thanked Margaret and walked toward the front door, the little brass bell chimed softly above him. The library remained just as peaceful as the day he had first arrived. And somehow, he knew a part of it would travel with him wherever he went. The afternoon train pulled away from Cedar Hollow with a long, gentle whistle. Ethan found a seat by the window and watched the little town slowly fade into the distance. The library's warm windows disappeared behind rows of maple trees. Soon, only rolling hills and quiet fields remained. He reached into his notebook and found the handmade bookmark. The pressed maple leaf was still perfectly preserved. He smiled and slipped it back between the pages. Across the aisle, a young boy was trying to read a book that seemed much too large for him. Every few pages, he frowned and started again. Ethan leaned over with a kind smile. "Would you like some help?" The boy nodded. For the next few miles, they read together. When the train reached the next station, the boy thanked him before stepping off with his family. Ethan watched them disappear into the crowd. Then he looked out at the peaceful countryside once more. Margaret had been right. The library wasn't something he had left behind. It had quietly changed the way he moved through the world. Sometimes, the greatest gift a place could offer wasn't a book. It was the reminder to slow down, notice the people around you, and share a little kindness whenever you could. The train continued its steady journey beneath the wide afternoon sky. For the first time in many years, Ethan wasn't thinking about where he would arrive. He was simply grateful for the road between here and there. Several months passed. Life became busy again, but not in the way it once had. Ethan still worked, still traveled, and still wrote. The difference was that he no longer rushed through every day. He made time for morning walks, quiet cups of tea, and a few pages of a good book before bed. One crisp autumn afternoon, he found a small package waiting outside his apartment. There was no return address, only his name, written in familiar blue ink. He carried it inside and carefully untied the string. Inside was a beautifully bound book with a blank cover. Tucked between its pages was a handwritten note. It read, "Dear Ethan, every reader eventually becomes a storyteller. When you're ready, fill these pages with the moments that taught you to slow down. Someone you may never meet might need them one day. Margaret." Ethan smiled. The book contained only empty pages. At first, it seemed unfinished. Then he understood. Margaret hadn't sent him another story. She had invited him to begin his own. He placed the book on his desk beside the blue bookmark. Outside, autumn leaves drifted gently past the window. Inside, Ethan opened to the first page. He picked up his fountain pen, smiled to himself, and began writing. Every meaningful library, he realized, eventually sends its readers back into the world, not just to read stories, but to live them. Nearly a year later, Ethan stepped off the train at Cedar Hollow once again. The station looked just as he remembered. The bakery still filled the air with the scent of fresh bread. The maple trees still lined the quiet streets. And at the end of the road, the library's windows glowed with the same warm light. When Ethan opened the familiar oak door, the little brass bell chimed softly. Margaret looked up from the front desk and smiled. "I had a feeling you'd come back." "So did I," Ethan replied. They shared tea by the fireplace while readers quietly turned pages around them. Nothing felt different. Yet everything had changed. Not the library. Ethan. He noticed he no longer checked the time. He no longer reached for his phone out of habit. He simply enjoyed the peaceful rhythm of the room. Margaret looked at him with a knowing smile. "You've brought something back with you." Ethan nodded. "I've been writing. And I think I'm finally writing the stories I want to tell." Margaret's eyes brightened. Then the library did exactly what it hoped. Ethan looked around the familiar shelves. For the first time, he understood. The library never stayed open because people needed more hours to read. It stayed open because some hearts needed a little more time to become quiet. Outside, evening settled gently over Cedar Hollow. Inside, another reader opened a book. And another quiet journey began. The following morning, Ethan carried a small leather journal beneath his arm. Over the past year, he had filled its pages with quiet moments. Morning walks, conversations with strangers, rain against his window, simple days that once would have passed unnoticed. Margaret welcomed him with a warm smile. "You finished it." "I did," Ethan replied. She led him to a small bookshelf near the fireplace. A carved wooden sign above it read, "Stories shared by our readers." Only a handful of journals rested there. Each one looked different. Each one had been written by someone whose life had been gently changed by the library. Ethan placed his journal on the empty space waiting between them. He didn't feel proud. He felt thankful. Margaret nodded softly. Every book on this shelf began with someone who thought they had nothing important to say. Ethan smiled. "Maybe ordinary days are worth writing about after all." "They always were," Margaret answered. She stepped back and looked at the shelf. "Now your story may quietly encourage someone you'll never meet." Ethan glanced at his journal one last time. He wasn't leaving a part of himself behind. He was leaving a small light for the next traveler. Outside, the maple leaves danced in the gentle breeze. Inside, another peaceful story had found its place on the shelf. The morning sun bathed Cedar Hollow in a warm golden light. Ethan stood outside the library with his travel bag resting beside him. The maple leaves rustled gently overhead. Margaret walked with him to the front gate. Neither of them hurried. Some goodbyes were meant to be slow. "I suppose it's time," Ethan said. Margaret smiled. "It always is." Before he turned to leave, she handed him a small folded card. "There is one last thing I'd like you to remember." Ethan opened it carefully. Written in her neat handwriting were just a few words. "Wherever you go, leave every place a little quieter than you found it." He read the sentence again. It wasn't about silence. It was about kindness. About listening. About leaving people feeling lighter than before. Ethan slipped the card into his notebook. "I'll remember." "I know you will," Margaret replied. At the station, the train gave its gentle whistle. As it pulled away, Ethan looked back one final time. Margaret stood outside the library, waving beneath the great maple tree. The warm lights inside the building still glowed, welcoming whoever might arrive next. Soon the town disappeared beyond the hills. But the peace Ethan had found there remained. Some places never asked you to stay forever. They simply taught you how to carry a little of them wherever life took you. Years passed quietly in Cedar Hollow. The maple tree grew taller. The bookshelves welcomed thousands of new stories. Every evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, warm light still shone through the library windows. One autumn afternoon, a young traveler stepped off the train. A backpack rested heavily on their shoulders. Their face carried the familiar look of someone who had been living too fast for far too long. As they wandered through the quiet streets, one building caught their eye. The old library. Its oak door stood slightly open. The little brass bell chimed as they stepped inside. Behind the front desk, Margaret Ellis looked up with the same gentle smile. "Welcome," she said. "You look like you've had a long journey." The traveler nodded. "I think I have." Margaret placed a warm cup of tea on the desk. "Then perhaps you've arrived at just the right place." The traveler smiled for the first time that day. Nearby, on a shelf marked stories shared by our readers, a small leather journal rested among many others. Its cover simply read, "Ethan Brooks." Someone reached for it. Another quiet story was about to begin. Outside, the evening breeze stirred the maple leaves. Inside, pages turned softly beneath the warm glow of the reading lamps. The library had never stayed open because the books needed more time. It stayed open because people sometimes did. And as long as someone arrived searching for a little peace, the lights would always be on. The end.